So I know that now when we think political parties, we think, Democrats and Republicans. But, you know, in 1797 to 1800, during John Adams' presidency, things looked a whole lot different. So although George Washington said, we're not going to do political parties, stay away from them, they're a horrible idea, they divide people. John Adams' presidency was filled with conflict and with issues because of these two very different political parties. So you have the Federalists and you have the Democratic Republicans. So the Federalists were founded by Alexander Hamilton, and you have really important figures like the president at this time, John Adams, who also identifies himself as a Federalist. And you're seeing that more wealthy, educated aristocrats kind of make up this Federalist political party. They believe in a strong national government and a really loose interpretation of the Constitution. So I know that we talked about this before when we did President of the Week and we were talking about, both John Adams and Jefferson, but Adams had this idea that the central government needed to be very strong, it needed to have a lot of power and control over what happened in the country. And a lot of Federalists also had this point of view that if the Constitution didn't specifically say you can't do something, that it's pretty much okay to do. Whereas we know that, people like Jefferson thought very differently about that topic. You also see that the National Bank was applauded by them. They thought it was a great thing, and they thought that national debt wasn't an awful thing, but the central government, of course, needed to really help out the states with their own individual debts. And this is really, the theme of the central government being the end-all be-all for people like Adams and Hamilton, who are Federalists. And lastly, since this time has a lot of, foreign entanglements with people like Britain and France, it's important to understand that, during this time you have the French Revolution that's unfolding, you have this never-ending conflict that's still going on with Britain and France, and the Federalists tend to take the British side in this entire thing during the French Revolution because they're very money-oriented, and with Britain comes a lot of money from trade, and the Federalists really can be summed up as, central government being powerful, caring about money, 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 and a looser interpretation of the Constitution. But, since we talked about the Federalists and, key figures that are involved in that political party, now we'll switch our focus to Democratic Republicans. And, we have to put faces and names to this political party to make it make more sense in this historical context. So we see people like Thomas Jefferson, who would be our third president, and James Madison, who founded this political party. And this political party really is centered around state rights. And I know we talked about this when we talked about Thomas Jefferson during President of the Day, or President of the Week, I'm sorry, but he is very adamant that state rights should really overpower this overarching, superiority and power that the central government has over the country. So this political party is made up of commoners and middle class, even though obviously we know that Jefferson and James Madison are, very much upper class and aristocrats. They're part of this political party that is made up of a lot of just average everyday people. And they have a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. So you're going to see Thomas Jefferson believe that every single thing in the Constitution should be read right down to the word. He went against this a lot when he made the Louisiana Purchase, as we can see, because he kind of, took an alternate route that wasn't in the Constitution. But overall, Democratic Republicans are very serious about reading the Constitution word for word. Also, they're against the National Bank. They think, of course, it gives too much power to the central government, and they believe that states really should take care of their own thing. So we saw in the video for Jefferson during President of the Week, he says what happens in Virginia should stay in Virginia. And that's really, the theme of the Democratic Republicans. Each state deal with your own stuff, and the government doesn't really need to be involved in too much, the central government. And you're also going to see this theme of Democratic Republicans favoring the French in the French Revolution during everything that's going on with the French Revolution and the conflict with Britain at this time. You're going to see that they take the French side because they realize, if it wasn't for the French taking our side in the American Revolution, where would we be today? And at this point, there's still some uncomfortability and distrust between the United States and Britain. So I know that was a mouthful and it's a lot to talk about, but it's important to understand the key differences between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, because during John Adams' presidency, these two political parties go neck to neck, and oftentimes they're on completely opposite sides of, how they handle situations and the things that happen. All right, so if we rewind a few weeks, obviously we spent an entire day talking about John Adams during President of the Week, and I showed a nice little 3-minute video that I tried to include in here, but, PowerPoint was acting a little weird, so I'll just go over, the basics of what we saw in the video and what we saw in the lesson that day. So to start, obviously we know from Mr. Miller talking to you guys about the Revolutionary era and the Revolutionary War, that John Adams wasn't just a vice president, he wasn't just a president, he really was like one of the key founding fathers that helped to get America its independence. You saw that he usually went against the grain and he didn't really do what the public wanted him to do. And you see this date back all the way to the time when he decided to defend the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. This infuriated people, but John Adams was always, very firm in his belief that he wanted the right to a fair trial in his new country, and he wanted a foundation of his country to be a certain way. And this carried true through the rest of his life, because as we see, after the nation becomes independent, he's George Washington's vice president, which he was very, very unhappy about. He felt like it didn't suit him and he deserved more for all that he's done. And after he is vice president, the first vice president, he then becomes the second president of the United States. And after his first term, loses to Jefferson, making him the only one-term president. And I know that's a little difficult to kind of unpack because it's so much politics going on in a short amount of time, but he had a really rocky presidency. He did a lot of things that confused a lot of people and made a lot of people angry at him. Things like the Alien and Sedition Acts that we'll talk about, his reaction to the XYZ affair, which he might have made bad decisions regarding how to handle issues with France that made people angry. And ultimately, he ended up losing his second election to Thomas Jefferson in 1800. So besides all this, and we'll unpack this all in the later slides, it's also important to see who was behind John Adams. So you had Abigail Adams, who was his wife, who I know Mr. Miller and myself have talked to you about as being, such a powerful woman and kind of being lost in the shadows at this time because women weren't applauded the way that they should have been. And it's also important to understand that, his son, interestingly enough, John Quincy Adams, became the 6th president of the United States. So obviously he had a very important political career. He really dedicated his life to this country, regardless of the things he did that, may have made people angry, regardless of how stubborn and hot-headed he was. He was crucial to our country becoming independent, and he really dedicated his entire life to that. The XYZ affair was really a messy situation in the beginning of John Adams' presidency that would set the stage for a lot of the things that happened during the 4 years that he was in office. So we'll dive right into this. So the XYZ affair started because France was absolutely furious with the United States at this time. France and the United States had a treaty that, if something happened military-wise with France and a different nation, that the United States would step in the same way that France stepped in for them during the American Revolutionary War. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case. France is now seeing the United States making treaties like Jay's Treaty to keep the peace with Britain, and they're also seeing them kind of step out of the spotlight and say, we're going to mind our own business, we're going to stay neutral, and we're not going to get involved in whatever's happening with you in Britain at this time. And this is making France furious. They feel like, the United States owes it to them, so they end up attacking American ships. They use things like impressment, which we talked about before, to, cause damage on the waters and essentially ruin, United States ships. And this is making John Adams furious. He feels like this is disrespectful to his nation, but he doesn't want a war this soon on after the American Revolutionary War and this soon on in the new nation. So he sends 3 diplomats from the United States to go discuss with 3 diplomats in France. So he sends John Marshall, Charles Pinckney, and Elbridge Gerry to go meet with 3 diplomats that really the United States press calls Diplomat X, Diplomat Y, and Diplomat Z. And this goes awful. because instead of getting to meet with Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, these three diplomats say to the United States diplomats, we need $250,000 bribe just for you guys to talk to the foreign minister. We also want a $12 million loan for the war that we're fighting with Britain, and we want an apology from President John Adams before you guys can even discuss neutrality and, peace with us. And instead of Charles Pinckney and Marshall and Jerry saying, okay, that's a good deal, they leave. Americans are furious at this. They feel disrespected. They feel as though there needs to be a war. They would rather, save their money and put it towards the war than give France what they asked for. They find it disrespectful to the point where even George Washington is willing to come out of his retirement to gather up the troops and lead an army towards, a war with France. But regardless of all of this, and regardless of this urgency and this excitement for war in the United States, John Adams isn't having it, and he doesn't want to go to war. And this makes people in the Democratic Republican Party angry. This makes people in the Federalist Party, his own party, so angry. And that's really not a good look, because as a president, you don't want people on both political parties to think that a decision you're making makes no sense. And that's exactly what happened as a result of this. So regardless of John Adams saying, I don't want a war out of this XYZ affair, you're seeing this quasi-war, which is an undeclared war, start to erupt. And this will go on for 2 years, and it's really a naval war that happens between American ships and the French ships in waters that used to be neutral. And this really becomes a war zone, and this brings in things like a new amped up Navy for the United States, and it brings back the Marines. So although this is an undeclared war, the XYZ affair led to the quasi-war, which led to, this innovations in military, military branches and things like that. So this event really was not a good look for John Adams, but it definitely led to some important things during his presidency. So as I said in the previous slide, regardless of the fact that John Adams didn't want a war and he said no to the war that the American citizens really wanted with France, there was this undeclared naval war that was happening on the seas between France and the United States called the Quasi-War. And this happened really from, 1798 to 1800, but this was in the mind of the American citizens from 1797 on. So July 1st, 1797, the Navy Act really put this idea into the minds of Americans that a war was on the horizon and they need to be prepared. So they brought back things like the Marines. They discussed how to amp up the Navy. They were prepared to fight the French. They built private ships that were huge and really were crucial in taking down 90 French ships during this quasi-war, and 49 ships were made by 1800. And if you look at the picture, obviously these ships are no joke. They're huge, and it really is the first sign of this military power that the United States was capable of so early on. Like I said in pretty much all of these slides, John Adams' presidency was a super rocky one. He did a lot of great things for our nation, but he did a lot of things and passed a lot of legislation during his presidency that infuriated a lot of people, and the Alien and Sedition Acts are a perfect example of one of those things that he probably shouldn't have done if he wanted to win the election of 1800. So with the Alien and Sedition Acts, there were two different things he focused on. The first thing being aliens entering the country and living in the country. So things like immigration, things like buckling down on who comes and goes because of these issues with France. He was super paranoid about information going back and forth between us and the nation that we were, having this conflict with. So he buckled down a lot on that. And more importantly, I think when it comes to, him angering the public, the Sedition Act made it a crime for newspaper editors, writers, or speakers to criticize the government. And like we've talked about, because I know we're, in the unit where we're talking about the Constitution, this goes against everything that the First Amendment of the Constitution stands for. And the First Amendment is a biggie because it protects, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. It gives Americans that freedom and that voice that they wanted when they were colonists, that they finally got when they were a new nation. And now John Adams is ripping the carpet out from underneath of them, and it is making a lot of people angry, particularly the Democratic Republicans like Thomas Jefferson, who were using newspapers and, documents and things like that to really express the way that they felt about this presidency, which was not always positive. So this was a really controversial, crazy piece of legislation in the eyes of the American public that ended up leading to other legislation like the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which said, we're not listening to this. It's unconstitutional. So the Alien and Sedition Acts, it's fair to say they were a huge reason why John Adams was unsuccessful in becoming president for a second term. Like I said in the previous slide, the Alien and Sedition Acts were really considered a huge fail, that John Adams passed this legislation, that people were so angry about it, that it was a big reason that, he lost the election of 1800 to Jefferson. And most of all, he had a lot of people who decided that, this was unconstitutional, it doesn't make any sense, and we're not going to abide by this law. And a good example of this is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So you're seeing people like Jefferson and Madison from Kentucky and Virginia saying in 1798 that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. They go against, this idea that we have that state rights are important and state rights deserve to, hold some power, the same way that Federalists believe that the central government should hold power. People like Jefferson and Madison believe that state rights have the power to nullify legislation that is simply unconstitutional and that goes against everything that the Constitution says. So this is so important because by nullifying this legislation, Kentucky and Virginia are essentially saying, we're not following this legislation because it doesn't make sense with what our country stands for. And this really holds true throughout history. And I won't get too much into this because I'm sure that, we'll get into the Civil War down the road. But this is the first instance of the doctrine of nullification that ends up becoming very noticeable and prevalent in the years leading up to the Civil War. The Logan Act was really made out of a nice Quaker man who thought that he was doing something good for the United States, but it ended up really going south for him and eventually leading in Congress creating this legislation that's still really important today. So just to break this down a little bit more, we know that Quakers were known for their peace and for trying to avoid war at all costs. So this Quaker man, Dr. George Logan, took it upon himself as just a regular citizen to try and negotiate with France and resolve all these ridiculous issues that were going on between the two nations at this time. And in 1799, when Congress really catches wind of this, they passed this legislation called the Logan Act that says that private citizens like Dr. Logan are not allowed to negotiate on any terms with foreign nations. So just because this one man took this step to try and solve issues between these two nations that obviously, the central government was having trouble solving, John Adams became infuriated. He thought that this was a job for the central government. People like Dr. Logan were taking the spotlight away from the things that the central government were supposed to do. And this legislation came out of this and is still so powerful today. It's a felony to break this act and to be, a regular citizen getting in contact with a foreign nation. So even though this was a simple thing that happened back then, some may think it was a simple thing that this man was trying to do to, resolve a huge issue. It turned into this big piece of legislation. Throughout John Adams' entire presidency, the 4 years that he was in office, obviously we have this elephant in the room that's this problem that seems to not be able to go away with France. So you have France and Britain in this conflict. They drag the United States in, which we talked about earlier. The quasi-wars going on, American ships, French ships, they're all, falling victim to this conflict, and there needs to be a resolution. So finally, in 1800, John Adams tries this whole thing again. Diplomats are sent back over to France, and this time it works. So the Convention of Paris in 1800 yields some great results and finally fixes the issues that had been plaguing John Adams' presidency this entire time and making people so mad at his decisions. So as a result of this Convention of Paris, you're seeing that the Treaty of Alliance that really made all of this a problem in the first place is gone. And when we talk Treaty of Alliance, this was really the treaty that came out of the American Revolutionary War, where France expected America to really have their back with every issue that they had. And this is why this naval war began, because, the United States wasn't holding up their end of the bargain. So with the Treaty of Alliance gone, now there's no expectations. It's a more peaceful atmosphere for the two nations. With this being said, there's neutrality on the seas, which means that the quasi-war is over. French ships, ships from the United States don't have to worry about impressment and attacking each other and this, undeclared war that's going on. The United States grants France the most favored trading status, and everything seems to be okay. It's important to realize, too, in the historical context of this time, that Napoleon, is the head of France at this time. He now has power, and he wants no beef with the United States. At this point, he has beef and drama with many different nations around the world, and this seems to be something that he doesn't want to dabble in. He doesn't want to get involved in this drama. So as a result of that, and as a result of, the United States sending diplomats over, peace with France is finally a thing, and all of this drama seems to be over. Throughout this time period, 1797 to 1800, it's very evident and it's very clear that slavery is still this, this really dark stain that is on the United States of America. It doesn't seem to be getting better in the South at this point, and it really doesn't up until the Civil War, but you're going to be seeing parts of the North really coming around to this idea of getting rid of slavery at their own gradual pace. So places like Pennsylvania have already made huge steps to get rid of slavery at this point. But as of March 29, 1799, now New York is coming around and they're making these steps and they're going down this road to abolition too. So as a result of this legislation, you're going to see that any child born after July 4th, 1799 is free, and this is huge because even seeing the word free next to someone who was a slave or whose parents are a slave is huge at this point. It's a big deal. And you're also seeing legislation saying that any existing slaves that are property of their mother's master will remain slaves, but until they're 25 for females and 28 for males. And obviously this is horrible and not ideal for anyone to be a slave for any amount of time, but the gradual process of New York trying to come around and get rid of slavery is a very important part of this time. Not only this, but it's important to really break this down in your head and realize that this is a big deal that the northern states are gradually getting rid of slavery, because it shows the huge difference between the North and the South and their economies. The South is really reliant on agriculture, which we can see before this and even way after John Adams' presidency, up until after the Civil War. But also, New York's economy is doing so well that they can make these steps, and their economy can, take care of itself without the labor of the slaves to really get them through. With slavery and with this horrible atrocity that happened in history, that is slavery, you're going to see slaves try and come together and escape slavery however they can and end this in their own terms. And that's really what Gabriel Prosser was trying to do when he organized this slave revolt that would happen in August 1800. So I should say that it was going to happen in 1800. But first, we'll break down who Gabriel Prosser is. So Gabriel Prosser was the slave of Thomas Prosser, and he really was set apart from other slaves during this time because he was a literate blacksmith. So during this time period, it was really an idea that slaves shouldn't have, their own knowledge. They shouldn't be literate. They shouldn't be able to know these things because it will give them this power to, think for themselves and try and revolt. And Southern states were really scared of slave revolts at this time because Haiti just had a successful slave revolt, which really rarely happens, and they were trying to keep, any sort of education and knowledge away from the slaves. So the fact that Gabriel Prosser was a literate blacksmith really set him apart. And he ended up planning this slave rebellion. And it wasn't just a small idea. It ended up attracting thousands of slaves who were ready to fight for this cause. And this was happening in Richmond, Virginia area, so the southern states. The southern states really weren't making the steps that the northern states were making at this time to get rid of slavery or gradually get rid of slavery. So slaves like Gabriel Prosser, obviously, it was a more desperate situation, and this was the result. So the day that this was supposed to happen, in the summer of 1800, a flood delayed the revolt one day, and Gabriel Prosser ended up getting betrayed by one of the slaves that were supposed to help him fight in this effort. This slave betrayed him for a reward from one of the white southern landowners, and it ended up ending with Gabriel Prosser and a bunch of the slaves who were willing to participate in this being hung and executed as a result. So this is really important to look at, because you look at slavery and you think, it was a horrible thing, but there's a lot of events like this, like Gabriel Prosser, that shows, the desperation that these slaves were going through to, have that taste of freedom, to get to where they wanted to be. Because even though the situation in the North was looking better, people in Virginia, the slaves in Virginia, they really weren't seeing light at the end of the tunnel, and things like this were bound to happen. All right, so clearly, as we all know, Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States of America. It has the White House, where presidents after John Adams have lived. And on December 12th, 1800, this does become the capital of the United States. There were talks in the early years of, our country being independent that maybe Philly would be the capital of the United States, but in the end, Washington, D.C. wins this title, and it is clearly still, the capital of our country today. So as we talked about in these slides, John Adams had a rocky presidency. He wasn't, dealt the easiest cards when it came to things he had to deal with as the second president of this relatively new nation, but he ends up losing this election to Thomas Jefferson. And as you can see on the picture on the right, he gets 65 electoral votes. Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson tie for 73 electoral votes. And in the end, a lot of these votes flip and they go towards Thomas Jefferson because, Aaron Burr wasn't the most liked individual, and Thomas Jefferson ends up winning. And this is called the Revolution of 1800. For a good reason. Thomas Jefferson says, this is the Revolution of 1800 because for once in history, for like the first time, this was a peaceful transition of power between two people who were from very different political parties and believed in two very different things and really didn't love each other during their political career. I mean, they butted heads a lot. They ended up having a good relationship at the end of their lives, but for the most part, they really weren't fond of each other and still were able to, transition this power of the presidency from Adams to Jefferson relatively peacefully and well. So this shows a revolutionary new idea of what the United States really stood for. So all in all, John Adams had this rocky presidency, and he only ended up serving for 4 years as the president of the United States.